Now, Israel is reeling today. Israeli commentators are calling the events there 9/11 and Pearl Harbor wrapped up in one. In other words, the sense of a nation attacked in a way that's left a deep feeling of vulnerability and trauma. The predominant emotion inside Israel appears to be shock and a sense of hollow disbelief that an attack of this scale could happen. The latest casualty figures, more than 700 dead inside Israel. And there are profound fears about the fate of the hostages taken to Gaza, with latest reports suggesting that 4 had been killed. Meanwhile, people in Gaza are bracing themselves for the assault that has begun in some parts of the enclave. And today, it's emerged that the Israeli defense minister, determined to crush Hamas, has ordered a complete blockade of Gaza with no electricity, no food, no water, and no fuel. Hamas is, of course, the de facto government of Gaza, where more than 2.5 million Palestinians live. It's also designated as a terrorist group by much of the Western world, including the US, the UK, and the EU. Its allies include Iran and Hezbollah militants in Lebanon, who say they've launched recent attacks on Israel in solidarity. So full-scale war could now be waged in the region. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from Virginia by a former Israeli paratrooper, Aric Mutchnick, who is currently a top security professional and counter-terrorism expert based in the US. Mr. Mutchnick, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. We appreciate the fact that you're busy and that you've given us this time. And of course, Israel's official declaration of war, both the Prime Minister and the Israeli cabinet have formally declared war. The first time Israel has declared war since 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. How does that redefine what is happening? Does it empower the Israeli government and the security forces to bring the full weight of the Israeli military apparatus to bear and to take revenge?
It certainly opens the door for them to align control and power. I would not use revenge as the word. That's not really the Israeli way. This is a defense. This is no different than a giant siege of Boko Haram into Abuja, right? This is a terrorist group that has entered civilian territory, taken hostages, killed children, all confirmed. And the Israeli government is taking the appropriate action with the support of much of the entire world, except for Iran, which has been identified as a terrorist nation itself, and Hezbollah, which is Iranian supported and also a terrorist organization. So that's kind of where we are.
Well, I mean, you are, of course, a former Israeli paratrooper. How astonishing is it for you that Israel is saying that it's still fighting with Palestinian militants on Israeli soil, and reports in Israeli media saying that more Palestinian militants were able to enter Israel overnight and the security fence has been breached again? I mean, how remarkable and unprecedented is it that despite the massive mobilization of Israeli troops towards Gaza, and despite the Israeli Air Force hitting hundreds of Hamas sites in Gaza, they're still fighting with militants on Israeli soil?
I mean, that happens frequently over the last 10 years, regardless. People come across and they attack. This is a larger breach, obviously. It's astonishing that this kind of intelligence failure occurred. And there's been a lot of conjecture as to why there was a failure of intelligence to predict that this might happen. And who knows? I mean, I haven't seen anything that has sparked total belief from my part. And you have to ask, what is Hamas's endgame? With an attack that's unlikely to be successful, in the end, they will pay for it. And it opens the door to siege Gaza, which is only going to hurt their own civilians. But from day one, Hamas has never cared about their own civilians. So that kind of dictates the actions of the Israelis. And I can tell you from being in constant communication with intelligence operatives in Israel, with civilians in Israel, my family in Israel. All of them feel terrible that civilian Palestinians are going to suffer from this as well. But unfortunately, we can't pick apart war. And Hamas decided to invade across the border, and now Israel is responding. But how many countries would you know that would notify civilians to evacuate the area before an attack? That simply doesn't happen anywhere except in Israel. So to me, it is a shock. Israel will come out and they will regain the security of their own soil. And then we all have to wait and see what the end game will be for Hamas. It could be the end of Hamas as we know it, in which case, who takes over? Who fills the power gap at that point?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the fact that the Israeli government informs people in Gaza to move away when attacks. But I mean, when you think of the fact that there have been more than 500 targets have been hit by Israeli airstrikes, I mean, you have to wonder. I mean, the Gaza Strip is just a small strip with 2.5 million people, enormously congested. What will the people in Gaza do when the Israeli government says, move? Where do they move to? I mean, is there any place to go? Is there anywhere that is safe for Gazans?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, one would imagine that they would have bunkers the same that Israelis do to protect themselves. Based on their infrastructure and the poverty there, I doubt it. But then, what is the decision to be made? Clearly, Hamas is using their own civilians as shields. They're using now Israelis as shields, Israeli children as shields. And at that point, you can't sit by and let rockets be fired upon civilian territory without answering. And it's funny that you mentioned how small Gaza is and congested. Israel itself is the size of Rhode Island in the United States. It's astounding. It should be astounding to all of us that these two tiny areas have created so much turmoil throughout the world. And our focus is now, all of our eyes are on a location that's so small, and unfortunately besieged by violence. And it's, my heart goes out to all of those who are suffering, but obviously my inclination is to see Israel victorious. And what does victory mean? Bringing peace back to Israel. And that's why I go back to your comment on revenge. The goal of nobody that I've talked to in Israel is to decimate the Palestinians in Gaza. Are there people who feel that way? I'm sure there are. But the overarching element of the Israeli path is to regain peace, not to destroy.
So is the expectation now that when the Israelis finally have their plan fully in place and have secured the border, they're going to have to launch some sort of a ground incursion into Gaza to try and rescue some of the hostages?
That's very likely the plan. I mean, the plan is obviously ever changing as the situation changes. Once Israeli soil is secure, then it becomes, they can take a breath, right? They can take a moment to discuss what the best plan forward would be. From what I've heard in reports, that they will not be negotiating with terrorists with regards to hostages taken. That being said, internal plans could prove otherwise. The fact of the matter is, slowly but surely, Hamas will be decimated. Their control will be erased. And then who fills that gap? And who tries to bring a sense of peace to the Palestinians as well, so that they can live and work and go to school? Well, until this is all over and the dust settles, it's going to be very hard to see how that happens.
Well, I mean, it's also going to be very hard to see how the Israelis will, because, I mean, they've promised to decimate Hamas, how they intend to do that without harming civilians. And, if you want to degrade Hamas to the point where it can't operate, which is understandable given the things that you've said and the fact that, your country was attacked and so on, I mean, the two simply can't sit together. But what would you say to those who say that the very reason why Hamas attacked when it did is because they've seen an Israel that's become divided and riven with hate and therefore weakened because of the government that Prime Minister Netanyahu has led? And there's a Defense Department where you've had people refusing to serve because they feel such disgust at what the government is doing, and that is what has undermined Israel's strength?
That's tough to say. I mean, if somebody said that, I would say, even 30 years ago when I served in the military, there were people who refused to serve. Continuously, extreme Orthodox Jews refused to serve. That's nothing new. The divisiveness in Israel is relatively new, and it is possible Hamas saw that as a weakness, which only tells me that their strategy is even more foolish, because what better way to unite a country than to attack civilians and bring them all together? So, at the very least, they've unified Israel in a way that it hasn't been in the last 5 years. Israel's divisiveness is the same we've seen across the globe, including the United States, right? The political divisiveness that, between the right and the left everywhere has been a problem. But you come into Israel and you attack civilians, and you'll find very quickly that Jewish unity is stronger than anyone thinks. And to think for a second that an attack on Israel isn't an attack on Judaism is a mistake, because it 100% is the problem.
Well, I think a lot of people around the world, including in Nigeria, many people agree that, and I think the example you gave of Boko Haram suddenly invading sort of Abuja and so on, I mean, it brings it home to a lot of people, and they can see why Israel would not just want but needs to defend itself. But there are always consequences, and looking at the likely consequences of what has happened, I wonder if we might draw a comparison with the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which took Israel totally by surprise. And as a result of the unpreparedness of that attack, the Prime Minister then, Golda Meir, resigned the following year, and it brought about the slow death of her Labour Party. I mean, are we likely to see Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a divisive character, much disliked by many Israelis, bearing the brunt and the blame for what's happened here? I mean, when the dust settles, the catastrophic lack of intelligence that you referred to, and the inability of the Iron Dome to protect Israel against Hamas missiles?
That's a great question. I mean, the comparison is an interesting one. And I mean, at the end, when the dust settles, most people look towards the leadership that was there and ask the question, how did this happen? That being said, we've seen leaders like Netanyahu and Trump and others who seemingly can do no wrong based on their followers' view. So it is very tough to say how it will end up. If anything, my wish is that it's a wake-up call for all Israelis to solve some of the smaller problems quickly so that they can unite and really start to deal with the bigger problems.
Mr. Mutchnick, I want to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us and sharing the benefit of your experience and your analysis with us. And you have a lot of sympathy here in Nigeria with Israel's cause, but there are also a lot of people who do not want Gaza to be decimated as a result. Aric Mutchnick is a former Israeli paratrooper. He's on the line from Virginia, and he's also currently a top security professional and counterterrorism expert based in the US. Thank you very much indeed.